Hey everybody, how are you today? I'm so excited. This is our last lecture of the semester for sociology. It's always kind of bittersweet. I'm happy that the semester is coming to a close because I'm ready for Christmas and I'm ready for a break. But at the same time, you guys have been a great class. I think we'd have had a ton of fun if we would have actually gotten to do all the activities we were supposed to. But I still really enjoyed having our discussions, and I hope you guys learned a lot this semester. So we're going to wrap up Chapter 7, our chapter on crime and deviance, by talking today about the end of Section 3, which is really about the criminal justice system. And so today we're just going to talk about what is the criminal justice system, what are the three parts of it, does it operate fairly and consistency, why do some people question whether they can truly trust the justice system, what role do prisons play in our society, is it effective, in stopping crime, and what other possible sanctions could there be as opposed to prisons? And what about the death penalty as far as an ultimate sanction? So let's get into it. So as you can see in the image below, the criminal justice system is really and truly made up of three things. It's made up of the police, it's made up of the courts, and then it's made up of the prison system. So basically, it's the idea that our police officers are the ones who are catching the bad guys, so to speak. They're catching people who are participating in deviant acts that are defined, as deviant by the courts. They are violating our most important social norms that we feel very strongly about. These mores have been written down into laws. And so they're going to be arresting you for it because you're committing some kind of crime against someone's property, against someone's person, that's hurting, someone else. And even technically, a quote-unquote victimless crime is still all in all a crime. Remember, we talked last time about those 5 different types of crime, which you're going to have to really familiarize yourself with. So that's really the role of the police. And we're going to talk today more about, when it comes to the police officers, how they choose to arrest people and how they actually don't arrest everyone. And do they apply the same standards every time in terms of fairness and equality? They're supposed to, but does it actually happen? Then you get the courts. And the courts are supposed to be, a very democratic way to decide whether someone is guilty or innocent by allowing, a court that is composed of a jury, made up of your peers to be able to decide. But yet again, does bias play a role? And does it really impact someone? Does wealth play a role because it impacts your ability to get a good lawyer? But all in all, technically, the law is applied the same every time for every person, supposedly, but is it really? Because the courts are also the ones that dole out punishments and they decide whether a person should receive community service or jail time and how much as far as the punishment for the crime. And then it comes to the actual prison system. What is it like in prison? In terms of maximum security prisons compared to other prisons that, don't have, that maximum security level that are almost more like hotels or spas or retreats. Why are things not really kind of enforced in incarceration? What skills are being taught? Are people being rehabilitated to get into the real world? So we're going to have kind of a discussion about this. We're not going to go into full depth. So if you're interested in this topic, perhaps, a career in law enforcement is for you. Or some kind of social worker, probation officer, corrections officer, something along those lines. So first, let's talk about the police officers. So we got to back our blue, got to back our police officers. They're the ones who tirelessly, work day in, day out to protect us. And, really and truly, we wouldn't be where we're at without our police officers. 90% of the time, 90% of the people follow society's norms, but not everybody does. They're not internalizing those norms the way that they should. They need some kind of positive or negative sanction to get them to follow the rules, so to speak. And people, of course, commit crimes because they think that they can get away with them. They think that they're not going to face any kind of punishment because the benefits potentially, outweigh, the potential of getting caught. Because, as they've moved to a new area, they're experiencing some normlessness because they've perhaps been raised, to think that it's okay to commit crimes. So people, for these various reasons, we said, do commit crimes. And then the police officer, their job is obviously to keep the rest of us safe. because as you live in a democracy, you have agreed to, as John Locke first said, you've agreed to a social contract. You've agreed to give up, to do whatever you want. You're not supposed to be going around robbing people, raping people, killing people. You give up the right to do whatever you want, and you agree to follow the rules, and in turn, the police, the government will protect your rights as well. So they have a difficult job ahead of them, and they're supposed to enforce the rules the same to everybody. But honestly, that doesn't always happen. Police officers, they have something called police discretion. They actually get to decide who they're going to arrest and who they're not. So the reason being is that the police physically can't arrest every single person who's committing a crime every single minute. There's just not simply a policeman on every corner. We don't have enough police officers. For example, I'm not going to lie, we had a staff meeting this morning and I was speeding on my way to work. I was very pleased that there was not a police officer for miles. Don't tell, okay? Obviously, there's nobody coming. I looked. I wasn't going that much over the speed limit, but I was definitely speeding a little bit this morning. So when it comes to, if I'd been caught, obviously I would have had, the ticket. Now, have I had the ticket before? Yes. Is it going to necessarily stop me from doing it again? No. But if I had multiple tickets, then perhaps it would. So yet again, it depends on the situation. There's some different factors going in there. But there's not a police officer in every corner. There's physically not. There's people speeding. There's people who are texting and driving. There's people who are committing all sorts of crimes all over America at every single minute. But they physically don't have enough police officers to arrest everyone. So police officers basically have to decide who the real threat to society is. So we give them a lot of discretion because they're the ones who see the criminal element on a day in and day out basis, and they have to decide what's the actual threat to our society and our safety, who are the real troublemakers, who should they go after. And they really and truly look at the seriousness of the offense. So if I was speeding, but somebody else was lighting a building on fire across the street, who do you think they're going to go after? Are they going to go after me, who's speeding 6 miles over the limit, or are they going to go after somebody who's setting a house on fire with people potentially inside? You see the situation there. So they really take the seriousness of the offense into account. It's also perhaps that they catch someone, who is selling illegal drugs and they only have a small amount on them. They might not actually prosecute that person. They may choose to say, okay, we're going to give you a deal and we want you to give up the name of the person that is giving you these drugs to sell. And if you give up that information, if you basically work for us, if you turn for us so that we can catch the big fish type of drug dealer, the distributor, not just small-time drug dealers, then we're going to perhaps let you go. So they're really taking the seriousness of the offense into account, thinking about, how it's going to help our society overall. If it's some kind of situation and somebody has been physically attacked, they will take the victim into account. So, if the police see assault occurring where someone is attacked, and the victim who gets attacked chooses not to press charges. Usually it's a domestic violence type of situation where perhaps husbands are more likely to be aggressors than women, we see from statistics. So if the police were called to a scene, perhaps by a neighbor, they walked in a situation, the husband was beating up the wife, and the wife chose not to press charges, there's only so much they can do. They may choose to still arrest the person anyway. They may go so far, though, as to let the person go with simply a warning and then kind of keep a watchful eye on the situation. As they are called to a scene or questioning a witness, yet again, they might not actually arrest a person if they're simply asking them a few questions, if the person seems to be honest, cooperative, working with the police. But if they seem to spit at the feet of the policeman, if they're disrespectful, if they have an attitude, if it seems like they're hiding something, if it seems like they're very nervous, if it seems like they have some information that they're not willing to bring forward, and they're just in some ways not cooperative, they're probably going to arrest them to bring them in for more information. Statistics also show us that if the suspect is African American or if they're Hispanic compared to a white person, the police are far more likely to arrest them and to use physical force against African Americans. So this goes into a lot of racial profiling here. So basically, this kind of goes along with our conflict theorists. Remember, our conflict theorists say that crime is inevitable in a society because you've got people who have money and who have power, and they're kind of flaunting it over everyone else in society. And people who are in the lower economic rungs of society who lack power and wealth are constantly going to try to push for a better life. And so as they try to push for a better life, they perhaps are more likely to commit crimes. And as they commit those crimes, of course, they're going to be arrested and face charges. And unfortunately, we see that, a lot of minority groups face poverty, so hence they're more likely to commit crimes, and then hence they're more likely to get arrested. The other situation is that, people who are in power already, who tend to be whites in American society, they're the ones writing the laws as legislators at the state and federal level, and they're the ones who are really telling the police officers, you have to be wary of African Americans, of Hispanics, of minority groups, that they're more likely, they're going to say things like they're going to commit violent crime, they're going to attack you, they're going to come into your home, they're going to, assault you, steal your stuff, rape, murder you, you need to be wary. And so the people in power are giving this message to the police officers, and so the police officers are going to, of course, focus more on those groups. Now, what statistics actually show us is that the vast majority of crime in America is actually not violent crime, right? We see it's a lot more focused on property crime. And so conflict theorists would say that that's basically a futile attempt by the whites in power to maintain their power and to stop other, minority groups from gaining power. Now, what statistics also show us is that African Americans, Hispanic Americans are likely to engage in violent crimes, and they're also likely to be the recipients of violent crime. So what we're getting at is that most of these people live in neighborhoods where crime is a normal part of their society, and violent behavior is perhaps a normal part of their society, and so they're more likely to get attacked and then to retaliate in return. And so, yet again, yes, it occurs, and it's not something that is happening in certain communities compared to others. So we see much, different percentages there. So since the police officers are getting messages, by lawmakers saying you need to watch out for certain groups, and then they're more likely to be called to certain neighborhoods, they probably most likely do get a bias in their mindset, which they say that, this community never has any violent crime, this community always has violent crime, and it's usually against, different groups, especially if there's a gang element going on, or yet again, because people are in lower economic situations, they're going to fight or steal for resources. That's going to be a motivating factor. Police officers often do get a bias, and they do, start to believe that, African Americans, Hispanic Americans are more likely to commit a crime than white Americans. Now, do all police officers have that bias and feel that way? No, but we know that it has happened. And so then we start to see racial profiling, where basically, African Americans, Hispanic Americans are more likely to be stopped by a police officer than perhaps a white American. And this is something that's happened in our society for years and years and years. And I honestly don't know if it's going to change anytime soon. I posted George Floyd's video. I'm sure you guys are familiar, of what happened this summer, but in case you've been living under a rock, right? George Floyd was using counterfeit bills, and, he was using them at a convenience store. The convenience store clerk realized this after the bills were passed, called the police. Floyd and some friends were sitting in a car across the street from the convenience store. The police talked to the convenience store owners, and then went and approached the vehicle. They arrested Floyd, and then, of course, so they had probable cause, and reason to suspect, and, they had, obviously a witness who had ID'd him, but then, of course, they go on to use excessive force. So, yet again, there's a whole, sociological theory going on here, which basically says that, police officers are more likely to use racial profiling and to basically play judge and jury in a way, and to assume that because of the color of someone's skin, they're more likely to have a bias, and then they're more likely to use excessive force during the arrest. So there's the bias there going on, but here's the other part of the flip side of the coin. If African Americans and Hispanic Americans are the ones who are more likely to get arrested, because that's been kind of ingrained in police officers' minds by lawmakers, they're the ones you should be fearful of, and they're the ones you should watch out for, and that's kind of what they've been taught, and that's a norm to them, then they're simply doing their job, and they're told this is the group you have to watch out for, Then once they become a police officer, that's where the most violent calls are. So they're actually seeing that norm come true, so to speak. That's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then if those people do resist arrest in any way, they have to use violence to subdue them. And so yet again, it continues to make them to believe that their statement is true, that clearly this group is dangerous. You need to use force to protect yourself, to protect others, to keep the witness into custody, to make sure that a situation does not occur. Can people, though, take it too far? Can people, will use violence because they get personal pleasure out of it in terms of a sadism kind of concept? Yes. Can people, commit this violence because of racism and prejudice? Exactly, completely. Do many police officers use excessive force and make mistakes and jump to conclusion? Yes. But are there other police officers out there who do a fantastic job of keeping us safe every day and who truly don't have a racial bias and who don't use racial profiling and who don't use excessive force? Yes, there is that group as well. So George Floyd, of course, though, during his arrest, the police officer kneels on his neck for, nearly 8 minutes. And then, of course, George Floyd dies. He's unconscious at the scene, and then he's pronounced dead an hour later. And of course, it erupted into protests, throughout Michigan and, nationwide, of course, as, in the Quad Cities. I think here in Geneseo, you guys were on a curfew as well, but in the Quad Cities, it was a curfew. It was basically a lockdown. There was damage. There was violence. And it's really opened up these conversations about what happens next for America. How do we kind of keep a better eye on what the police officers are doing? How do we make sure that their body cams are turned on? So that's going to be your journal for today. That's one of the options. And I did post the YouTube video. They say it's got like a disturbing disclaimer at the beginning. I don't think, honestly, that it's super disturbing compared to like what's in rated R movies. It's really hard to see, in fact, what's happening. But because obviously that a person is dying, it is still incredibly disturbing. So that is one option if you want to watch, and that's from the Washington Post, I believe I got it from. If you want to watch that and journal about it and give me your thoughts about, are police officers racial profiling? Are they using excessive force? How do we stop it? What happens next? Kind of your thoughts about the Black Lives Matter movement and the future of kind of the criminal justice system. But if that one makes you uncomfortable or you don't watch the video for whatever reason, I've got another journal option as well. But obviously that's a hot topic that we can't just ignore, and that something needs to, happen in the U.S. And events like this are tragedies, but they also really highlight that change needs to occur. So now let's move on to talking about the courts. So when it comes to the courts obviously have a twofold process. And the twofold process is basically to decide if someone is guilty or innocent, and then obviously to dole out the punishment. So the whole problem with the courts is, first off, let's just mention that 90% of criminal cases are settled through what we call plea bargaining, meaning that they never even go to trial. There is some kind of compromise or deal worked out between the district attorney and the defendant's lawyer, and basically the person pleads guilty to some kind of lesser charge. So for example, if it was perhaps premeditated first-degree murder, their lawyer, the defendant's lawyer, especially if it seems like there's a compelling case against them or if they actually did it, they're going to hope to plead down to something like manslaughter, which is a lesser charge, so that they get a shorter prison sentence, to make sure that death penalty is taken off the table, something like that. And honestly, it's in the court's best interest to do this because the trial could go on for months. That leads to more expenses, and basically it keeps the person in the prison system longer, which yet again is a huge expense. And we have a lot of prison overcrowding in the U.S. So that's part of the reason for it. Now, do the courts get it right all the time? No, that's the problem. They're supposed to decide someone's guilt or innocence, but money plays a huge role here. In whole reality, if you would ever get arrested for a crime, which I really hope that, you make smart choices in life and, you follow our society's laws. But if you ever do get arrested for a crime, you need a lawyer. Don't ever think that you can definitely represent yourself, because that's not going to work. Yes, you have that right, but it's not going to go well. The other thing is that You are provided, if you look back to your constitutional rights, and you think about, cases like Gideon's versus Wainwright, yes, if you can't afford an attorney, an attorney will be provided for you. You've heard that statement before. It's read to you as part of your Miranda rights when you're arrested, at least ever since the case of Miranda versus Arizona. But really and truly, that person is a free defender and they're overworked. And if you really were facing any true charges, you would have to, empty your bank account, get a loan, and you would have to get a lawyer, because that's the only way you're going to have a true fighting chance, especially if it's a serious kind of crime and it's incredibly expensive. So a lot of times people say that it comes down to money, and that since people can't afford a good lawyer and they only go with a public defender, sometimes people are going to jail for crimes they didn't commit simply because they don't have the money for the better lawyer to defend themselves. Because it's just like everything else in life. I mean, you guys, as you are juniors and seniors, you're almost done with your education. You've had good teachers and bad. You know the difference at this point. And so it's going to be the same thing with doctors. It's going to be the same thing with lawyers. And that's why people go to different doctors, move to different areas, go to different schools, get different coaches, get different lawyers. So a lot of people say that our justice system is not fair. And people also say that, yes, technically, for most cases, unless in certain situations, it could be a bench trial where the judge does decide your guilt or innocence. But for the most part, it is going to be a jury made up of your peers. But is it really? Is it truly not a biased, jury? Throughout much of American history, if you look back to our Jim Crow era, the jury was made up of, whites, and if it was an African American on trial, they were racist and they assumed that the person simply did it. People still, we feel like, are that way today. So if the police are more likely to arrest an African American or Hispanic American, for a crime, and yet when it comes to the jury, if there's only one Hispanic American or one African American on that jury and it's made up of all whites, we see that race sometimes does play a role in the part of the jury as well. And many people are likely to, convict this person and assume that they're guilty, even if the evidence is circumstantial. So yet again, how fair really and truly is it? Is the punishment being doled out consistently? And there's honestly evidence which shows us that juries are more likely to give lesser sentences for whites compared to Hispanics and blacks. So literally there's evidence which shows us that when it comes to a white person, they're more likely to be like, oh, okay, well, it was their first offense. We're just going to give them, 6 months community service, and that's it. Compared to the same, crime, whatever it may have been, whether it was assault or, a minor drug possession, something of that nature, they're more likely, if they're Hispanic or African American, even if it's their first offense, to give them like 2 years in jail. And that's what the statistics show us. And so all you can yet again assume is that race is playing a bias here, and that people are more likely to still judge you based off the color of your skin, which is terrible, but it's happening. At least that's what the data is showing. So yet again, can you trust our justice system? Is it fair? It's a lot better than they have in other countries, but it's still not the best by any means. We still have a ways to go. So the last part of our criminal justice system is, of course, the correction system, the prison system itself. And there's so many thoughts about our prison system. The first really being, what is the role of the prison system? What is it supposed to do? When we look at other countries like Sweden, Norway, Finland, look at those Scandinavian, the Three Fingers, they're more focused on rehabilitation. And honestly, if we had a regular schedule this year, I usually have kids read an article and answer some questions, look at some pictures of prisons in other countries, and you would be amazed. It reminds me of like a hotel or like a camp in a way, or a school, because they're focusing on treating people like real people and giving them more job skills and educating them, and then helping them to slowly transition into the community and really focusing more on job skills. Now, do we do that here in the U.S.? Yes and no. As the person is thrown into a prison, there are obviously different level security prisons, right? So, if you are the worst of the worst, you're going to be in a maximum security prison compared to more minor prisons. And, people like Lori Loughlin, right? So the woman that was on Full House, who was just participating recently and got convicted, right, for this whole college scam where she was basically, paying the rowing team to giving them a huge donation and paying for her daughter to be on the rowing team so she could get into what I think it was USC or one of the colleges there in California, yet her daughter isn't even a rower, has no skills there. So she got a slap in the wrist. She got to go to one of these low security, basically like hotels, so to speak, that was supposedly prison, which I guess for these people it would be very difficult. You still have to wear, different orange jumpsuits, different clothes. You can't go anywhere. You have no freedom, so to speak. But in general, it's not like what the most of us would really think of as far as prison. Now, for the most part, when it comes to prisons, you do have some prisons where people are still mining, making license plates. But for the most part, people have jobs in the prison, whether they are doing laundry, whether they were cooking, taking out trash, working in a library, working in a hospital. They do receive a low amount of wages so that they can use that money to basically buy cell phone cards, different personal hygiene items, things like that. So there is a little bit of personal identity. There is a focus on work and basically wealth, but there are illegal goods that come into prisons. There is basically a black market. There is basically a gang system. There is kind of a social hierarchy. People get beat up in prison. People get raped in prison. So there's all sorts of violence in the system. And do the corrections officers know about this? For the most part, yes. Some of them enjoy and kind of have a sadism kind of streak, and it's really scary. And they perhaps enjoy seeing these people get beat up. They even think that these people perhaps deserve the violence. Because there is the flip side of the coin, where many people believe that if these are the criminal elements of society, they should be locked up. They should be isolated. They should be away from the rest of us, or the good people, so to speak, because it's the social protection element. And they feel that these people should be truly punished for what they did. And so they're okay with the violence that occurs because they figure they deserve it. They're animals. But here's yet again the mentality. If you take a bunch of people who have committed a crime and you put them together, how can you expect for things to go well? And the best way I can equate this to you is, I'm sure as you've walked into a classroom before, you've naturally in your head, even though some of you say that we don't have cliques, you know who, quote unquote, the good kids are, the kids who do their homework, the kids who get the good grades, compared to the kids who are the troublemakers. And I'm sure you've walked into a class before and you've kind of categorized kids as far as who am I going to hang out with, who am I going to do a project with, who am I going to work well with. And I'm not sure if you think back to elementary school, were there troublemakers in a class? Were there kids who were always in trouble with the teacher, who missed recess, who got the detention? Thinking back to our class just at the beginning of the semester, I'm sure you might have some different, names that come to mind. So thinking about that, if you take people who are the troublemakers, quote unquote, and you stick a bunch of them in one classroom together, that classroom is more likely to be chaotic. It's a lot more difficult for the teacher to manage that classroom, to keep the kids on task and learning and focused and engaged, and there might be a lot more discipline problems. So the same thing is going to happen in a prison. If you're taking a bunch of people who are the quote-unquote troublemakers, the criminal element, and you're putting them together, you can only naturally assume that there's going to be violence and problems. And so is it really a good idea? I mean, if you're going to lock these people up for life, yeah, okay, I guess that could work. But otherwise, how are these people ever going to be able to get rehabilitated and come back into society when now it's become normal to them to talk about criminal acts, behavior, and deviance? If you think about our, differential association theory, they say that you're more likely to commit deviant acts and to be a criminal the more time you spend with criminals. So the more time that you spend in prisons, aren't you more likely then to engage in that behavior later in life? How can you ever fully come back into our society? Well, that's kind of the job of the parole officers. Their job is to basically figure out, how do we watch these people? How do we rehabilitate them? How do we give them community service? How do we have them work in a halfway home and then eventually, get jobs? But it's very difficult, especially because many people who are felons and have committed that more serious crime, they have that, that label of secondary deviance, and it's going to be very difficult for them to ever live a normal life. So I've kind of already talked about the four functions of the correction system, right? That the functions are retribution, getting revenge for the victim, which is why some people say we should have prisons. Some people say we have prisons because, right, it's a deterrence. People aren't going to commit a crime because they know, okay, if I steal a car, I'm going to go to jail. Retribution, right? So if they killed someone, they deserve to be in jail. That's the whole idea of getting revenge for the victim. At the same point, maybe the purpose of prisons is to rehabilitate people, to teach them a new skill, to teach them how to follow our society's norms, to teach them how to truly integrate with our society. And also the social protection element, as I mentioned, to keep this troublemaker group from the rest of us. But here's the thing, our prison systems are not working. People repeat that criminal behavior. We know that over 50% will return to prison within 3 years. And some people simply return to prison because, yet again, that's what they've been taught. That's what they know. That's, what they have to, it's become just the norm to them. And they really don't know how to survive outside the prison walls. If you take somebody who's been in a prison for 40 years, it's going to be very difficult for them to leave the prison system, almost scary even, and to get a regular job. What are they qualified for? How are people going to treat them? So it's going to be a very difficult existence. So the last thing to really talk about is, when it comes to, the prison system, as I said before, what we've seen happen historically is that juries do give harsher sentences, longer prison sentences for people who are not white compared to whites. And, that's really kind of a scary thing. And of course, the whole reason behind it is most likely racism. That's really the only thought. But, prison basically is a sanction. It's a negative formal sanction to show people, this is the punishment that you deserve. And yet again, it's supposed to be deterrence to teach people that, if you commit a crime, this is the punishment, so you don't want to commit crimes. And of course, we need to talk just a little bit here at the end about the ultimate sanction. And the ultimate sanction, of course, is the death penalty. And the death penalty has been used for years and years, not only in the United States, but around the globe. The top picture that you see, this is from March 23rd, 2020. And what you can see is states that allow the death penalty versus states that do not allow the death penalty. So what you're looking at in red, that's states that allow the death penalty. If you're looking in the light blue, that's states that do not allow the death penalty. And that like purplish blue color, that states that the governor can have a moratorium, meaning that on death penalty, meaning that the governor basically has currently said, yes, there can be the death penalty in the future, but currently we're going to kind of shut down the death penalty because I'm not comfortable with it. Okay, so it has a lot of political party impact there, and so what we're seeing in more recent years is that Democrats tend to be more against death penalty, Republicans more for it, and so as you get one governor versus the next in a state, remember they can pardon people. The president can pardon people, and so they basically can put a stay on executions and basically put those off for a while, and so that's why we say there's kind of a temporary hold in those states on them. Now, when we're talking about the death penalty or capital punishment, historically it's always been used because it's the whole idea that the punishment should fit the crime. People thought that it was morally justified, going back to, ancient history of like ancient Babylon, eye for an eye. If someone cuts off, your hand, if you cut off someone's hand, they should have the right to cut off yours. If you take someone's eye, they should take yours. If you take a life, they should take your life. Obviously that view though has changed in recent years because people feel that our correction system and our criminal justice system really and truly has bias and is not being executed fairly. Now, in more recent years, people have really started to think that perhaps we should go away from the death penalty, and that it definitely should not be used because of the issues with the justice system. And if you're looking at countries that still do have the death penalty, what you're seeing in red in that bottom picture is the United States, some countries in Africa, some countries in Asia still use the death penalty. But for the most part, European nations have said that it's barbaric, that, that we shouldn't play God, that, we shouldn't be taking people's lives in our hands, that we say it's wrong to murder, yet we're going to become murderers ourselves, and that that's not something that they believe in. So most European countries have outlawed it. This chart's pretty interesting to me. It shows me in 2019 where the death's really occurring. And What you're looking at here is that when it comes to the death penalty, the country that is having the most executions would be China, and we're not even sure the exact number because, of course, China being a communist, more of really a socialist mixed market economy in more recent years, they hide that information, because they do have that leadership and power where they don't want to share that with us. The United States in 2019 killed 22 people with the death penalty. And so we're in 1, 2, 3, 4, the top 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's a lot of other countries which are way behind us. The only country in Europe that does use the death penalty, I thought I had a stat on that, but I guess not. I'm trying to remember what country that is right there. Excellent question. Egypt, US, Iraq, Iran, China. Do we see any countries below? Oh, Belarus. Okay, so right next to Russia there. That's the only country in Europe that's actually doing that. So the other thing that I wanted to mention was that really when a lot of these European countries started getting rid of the death penalty, that was in the 90s. And it's kind of been the more recent trend to kind of decrease the use of the death penalty, and more countries have gone away from it. Only 3 nations have introduced the death penalty since 1985, looking at some African, some Asian nations. Continuously, this issue will come up to the Supreme Court, as you saw more and more states in the U.S. are starting to say that the death penalty should not be used because of the problems with our court system. But the Supreme Court has continuously ruled that it does not violate our 8th Amendment of cruel and unusual punishment should not be used. And the other thing here is in terms of political party, I've got some stats here at the bottom. And interestingly enough, 74% of conservatives, so Republican Party, thought that it should be used, compared to 21% basically said no thank you, and 5% didn't have an opinion on it. And then when it comes to liberals, to Democrats, only 54% said it should be used, and 42% should it not be used, and 4% had no opinion, and you've got the moderates kind of in the middle. In more recent years, this one's from Pew Research Center in 2018, you start to see kind of an uptick in people who are starting to support the death penalty in the U.S., but in general, in the United States, our overall support for it has been waning, and kind of our use of it has been decreasing as well. And of course, the method of execution has changed over time as people have tried to find more humane methods that would not violate the 8th Amendment, which says we can't use cruel and unusual punishments against people who are incarcerated or in jail. And the Supreme Court has ruled that lethal injection is a humane way for people to die. Now, the arguments really and truly for and against the death penalty as an appropriate form of punishment, people still claim that it should be used because, it deters people from committing crimes, because they know that if they murder someone, that the death penalty is potentially on the table and they will die for their crimes. There is still kind of this retribution mentality for the victim that perhaps, and for the victim's family, that the worst criminals deserve to die for their crimes. This social protection mentality that, if they are a serial killer, that they definitely should be kept away from society, otherwise they perhaps will kill again. And some people say that incarceration itself is a dysfunction, because if you incarcerate someone and you just give them life imprisonment because they are a serial killer, that's very expensive. And so basically the death penalty is cheaper. Some people say it's not, but other statistics would say that yes, it is. And that the death penalty is cheaper, that it's a humane way to die. Some people would even argue that it's better to get it over with, in terms of, that mental state of being locked away for lives. But other people would say, no. It's, at least those people do have those lives. Some, they get to live out their life in prison, visit their family members, have visitors, write letters, etc. And of course, they're still alive. Conflict theorists basically say that the entire problem with the death penalty is that it's not being, you can't have it because you have police officers who racial profile people, who arrest people from the very beginning because of their biases, who perhaps didn't even commit a crime. And then those same people don't have the money for an excellent lawyer and they can't defend themselves, and then they go to jail for crimes they couldn't commit. And then, of course, we've seen people executed for crimes that they did not commit. And then, of course, sometimes the governor does come in at the last second and, give people a reprieve or a pardon. And we do sometimes some new evidence is, given, and the court retries a case, and hears that appeal. But many other times, people are on death row and perhaps die for crimes that they, didn't commit. And since this discrimination and disadvantages are occurring, we shouldn't have the death penalty. I already kind of talked about how the Supreme Court definitely had said that it's still constitutional and that it can occur. And so you're going to do your second journal if you want. This is the other option. All right, guys, that's it. Have a great day.